Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us here at the Kennan Institute. I'm Matt Rajansky. Um, Before I get started in speaking about this afternoon's event, the third annual James H. Billington Seminar on Russian History and Culture, I want to note that tomorrow morning we have an event with a Russian author, memoirist, Guzel Yakhina, who will talk at 11 o'clock on the fifth floor about her book, Zuleika Opens Her Eyes, which has been quite a hit in Russia and is now translated into English. So we invite all of you to join us then. Today's event is something that's always very special for us, given the role that Dr. Billington played in the history of the Kennan Institute and in our field. But this year in particular, since it's the first time that we've convened a Billington seminar since Dr. Billington's passing in December of last year, and we in fact just co-organized with the Library of Congress a memorial for him on Capitol Hill just last week. Dr. Billington was a larger-than-life figure in every respect. His work so well known, of course, but he was also very important for me personally as a mentor, and just always so welcoming and generous with his time and his advice. And so it means a lot for me to be able to welcome you all, host you at this event. That said, our esteemed Deputy Director, Dr. William Pomerantz, is going to take over moderating duties after my introduction here, and so I'll try not to drone on too long. I would note we also celebrate the 45th anniversary of the Kennan Institute this year, and of course Jim Billington was a co-founder of the Institute together with George Kennan and Fred Starr. When I met him in 2015 for the first time, we talked about that vision, and of course for him, as for the other founders, it was very much about keeping scholarship at the heart of understanding Russia, and that could hardly be more relevant today when it seems like 99% of what we hear about Russia is something other than scholarship. It's salacious scandal and politics and fear and everything else. So we're very glad to be able to bring you this taste of Billington's impact and legacy with our wonderful distinguished panel. Of course, many know the Billington name from his iconic book, no pun intended, The Icon and the Axe. Half a century later, it really is still the leading history of Russian culture in the English language. He came to lead the Wilson Center initially in the 1970s, but on the explicit condition of being able to create a national center for advanced research on Russia. And that is exactly what he did, together with George Kennan, whom he recruited as the distinguished Woodrow Wilson Fellow here at the center. Since that time, in the 45 years that the Kennan Institute has existed, we have had literally thousands of scholars come through this place as fellows and alumni. And so chances are, if you study Russia anywhere in the United States, or frankly in many parts of the world, you'll be hearing from someone who is a former scholar of the Kennan Institute or a conference participant. Jim Billington, of course, then went on to a 28-year tenure as Librarian of Congress. And among many other great accomplishments, he advanced the country's understanding of and capacity to engage Russia with a great many Russia-focused programs at the Library of Congress. As we look back at Jim Billington's legacy and his contributions to the world of academics and policy, a colleague of ours coined a wonderful phrase, which I'll repeat now, is that George Kennan may be thought of as the author of containment, but Jim Billington should be remembered as the author of engagement with Russia. So, with those words, I want to just say a word about the Billington Initiative here at the Wilson Center. We're very grateful to Mike Yenny and Walter Scott for their support of that initiative. The initiative has included 3 years' worth of Billington Fellows, of which Dmitry Kozlov is our most recently minted. Natalie Ruland is also with us. She was our second Billington Fellow. It's an effort with this program to bring the worlds of history and culture, which are not often associated with the kind of political Russia that we discuss here in Washington, but together in a meaningful and relevant way. And I feel like today's panel really does that. Great credit to the panelists. I won't steal their thunder. And I'm also going to forego the lengthy introduction of the speakers simply because you have this sheet that has their full bios and even their photos, so you can associate names and faces. But shortly put, the panel will seek to consider the historical context of protest activism, something that we hear about in the news about Russia all the time, but seldom see in a historical perspective. Dmitry Kozlov will open by considering the spatial dimension of public protests in the Soviet Union and in Russia. Then Kevin Platt from the University of Pennsylvania will talk about the anti-state aesthetics in postmodern politics. And finally, Mikhail Nemtsev of Georgetown will discuss absurdist protest movements in Novosibirsk. So a wonderful assortment of topics all around a theme, all very clearly relevant to today's politics and international relations. And that's exactly how Jim Billington would have wanted it, and I'm very pleased to leave you in Will's capable hands. Last note, yes, we have a reception afterwards, so we'll try to get to that promptly at 5:30. I think all of our speakers will join us, and I hope all of you will as well. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Matt, and I don't need to do any introductions, so we'll just turn directly to Dmitry.
Hello. So I'm very grateful for Kennan Institute and Woodrow Wilson Center that give me an opportunity to be here to do my research and to discuss it with my colleagues and with you. And so today I will present several observations of my project, which aim is to conceptualize the forms of how did public sphere in late Soviet Union work. To achieve this goal, I need to answer three questions. How did late Soviet institutions of control and repressions limit expressions of citizen doubts, disillusionments, and even disagreements to state politics? In what special social and geographical spaces, if there were any, such civil feelings could be expressed, and what social and symbolical role did the space for public action played in shaping the form and content of protest actions? Traditionally, Soviet society is characterized as a society with extremely little, if no, place for unregulated public actions, and undoubtedly we cannot use for analysis of the USSR the classic liberal models of public spheres, Jürgen Habermas or Hannah Arendt suggested, but as public sphere is a sphere for free dialogue and arguing between citizens, and the sphere for contesting the state politics. However, the contemporary researchers of historians and social scientists, they demonstrate that Soviet Union was not ideal totalitarian state. And so basing on those researchers who state the existence of quasi-public sphere in Soviet Union or different kinds of spoiled publicities, I argue that late Soviet Union had specific regime of publicity that combined not only of over-controlled social life by party and police institutions and representation of whole society support to the party, but also on cultural memory of pre-Stalin intra-party discussions and legacy of early Soviets. That was working councils, that was institutes for direct democracy. And last, but not the least, these rules of publicity, public behavior could be contested or even transformed by actions from below. Actions which were based on personal ideological views, artistic preferences, religious beliefs, and the knowledge of alternative contentious repertoires in terms of Charles Tilly. First of all, pre-revolutionary protests and foreign practices from contemporary foreign states. Combination of these components was changing from one Soviet epoch to another, and conflicts which became evident during such transformation give us one more instrument to analyze and to characterize both institutes of control and repression in Soviet Union and the political creativity of Soviet citizens. The period of Nikita Khrushchev, here he is, the 1950s, 1960s, which is traditionally called the thaw, was one of such epochs during which transformation of rules of public behavior could be traced most evidently. It was during the thaw when the Communist Party of Soviet Union first time demanded Soviet citizens to act and to speak more independently for improving the Soviet system and for restoration of revolutionary legacy, the ideas of Lenin and Marx. Of course, it wasn't a linear forward process, and Soviet authorities frequently used the same methods of control and repression as in previous decades, but the demands for criticism and self-criticism and the providing of some element of direct collective management met support mostly from the young generation of Soviet citizens. From memoirs and archival documents, we knew about multiple examples of public protests, like uncontrolled public discussions in student classrooms and dormitories, and about appearance of uncontrolled literary and artistic circles, about new political organizations, underground political organization, and even of strikes. But can we speak about contesting the state monopoly over public sphere? So I will tell quite short story. There is a city legend in Leningrad that on November the 7th in 1956, the age of the thaw, during the official October anniversary demonstration, it is a photo of early 50s, but the picture was the same in 1956. During the official October demonstration, the state-supported celebration of this event, a group of students protested against Soviet suppression of Hungarian rebellion that had happened a few days before, in the early November of 1956. Of course, all these students were arrested and imprisoned. In this interpretation, this event is a pure example of braveness, self-sacrificing, and the open expressing of opposition political views. There is another interpretation. The interpretation of this event as an artistic performance which contests not the ideological but discursive regime of Soviet state, as this quite the same way that the demonstration in Novosibirsk about Mikhail will tell us. And there were slogans not about free and independent Hungary, but about long life bloody cabal of Imre Nagy. It is some kind of mixture of ideological cliché from previous epoch of anti-Yugoslavian ideological campaign and support for recently executed Hungarian leader, or even the slogan is that was "Let's sink Gamal Abdel Nasser in Suez," which refers to contemporary Middle East crisis. So, however, that the work of historian is to tell that everything was much more complicated, and I will try. As we learn from the investigation file of Mikhail Krasilnikov, here he is in the center with the light bulb. He was a student of Leningrad State University and avant-garde poet, and the only one who was not only detained but also imprisoned after this demonstration. I work with his investigation file in the archive of Federal Security Service in St. Petersburg. And his friends and he did not even come to Dvortsovaya Square, where the city legend speaks that they were protesting the very heart of the Leningrad. They were not here. They were arrested on the other opposite bank of Neva River. They were incriminated in bawling out the slogans "Long live free Hungary," "Long live free Latvia," and several others, with strict political content. However, they could not neither confirm nor deny this accusation because they were too drunk to do it. It was funny. He spent 4 years of his life in a Moldovan camp, but of course it was very, very strange situation. And he was accused into anti-Soviet agitation and propaganda for this this story. And here, as I said, he was imprisoned. I think that one of the reasons, because he was only one of 4 persons who were detained after this bowling out slogans, was that he belonged to some kind of artistic circle that they like to enjoy the absurdist performances. Like they really went to do official demonstrations and provoke other participants to answer hooray for their absurdist slogans. For example, everyone shout hooray for long life to Nikita Khrushchev, hooray, long life to our beloved party, hooray. And they said, long life to Misha Krasilnikov, hooray, long life to cheap wine, hooray, and so on and so forth. They really did it, even Stalin was alive. But it wasn't the arrest, lead to arrest. But in 56, the story came to its end. Krasilnikov's case allows to formulate the question that is key to my work. Why any public action with controversial content will be primarily interpreted as a political dissent, not only by party and state, but also from average citizens. And there could be several reasons for such afterward politicization. First is the political context of this action. Krasilnikov, as I said, was arrested right after Hungarian rebellion and Budapest event. Even in official Soviet press, they were depicted and interpreted as a public mass protest that started with open discussions and rallies and finished with street violence. And this Hungarian scenario, the repetition of Hungarian scenario inside Soviet Union scared the authorities and inspired the dissenters. And so what could people speak loudly? Only the slogans to support the Hungary. The second reason is a temporal context. Krasilnikov was arrested during the October Revolution Day, at the most important holiday in the Soviet calendar. And already a few days after the arrest, the rumors about it spread along Leningrad, and everyone interpreted this arrest and this imprisonment as a profanation of a sacral date of Soviet calendar. Such kind of anti-behavior, the profanation, desacralization, has a long story in Russian culture, and it demonstrates the common pattern of protest behavior. And the third reason that is the most important for me is the context of public sphere. Sorry. Official Soviet regime of publicity did not imply the very possibility of public contesting state politics by society, not only because the extensive control and repressive apparatus. It was also the consequences, direct consequences of Marxist idea of sublation of the opposition between state and society after the transit to socialism. Thus, the dialogue between two parts of united and unified state-society combination is nonsense from this point of view. And the presentation of state power and whole society support is the direct consensus of such discursive manipulation. Thus, anything that could happen in public space would be automatically stigmatized as political crime if it violates such regime of publicity. Even it is a political presentation or unintentional violation of this regime. However, in the end of Khrushchev's rule, people who appear the new formation of protesters, people who consciously, not like Krasilnikov, but with their straight aim, contested the state monopoly over public spaces, and we call them dissidents. The very start of the Soviet dissent movement traditionally is connected with the meeting of Glasnosti of December of 1965, which was gathered to support arrested writers Andrei Sinyavsky and Yuliy Daniel in the very center of Moscow, Pushkin Square. And one of the slogans, in the up was a Soviet state, please respect the Soviet Constitution, the basic law of Soviet Constitution, because this Constitution, even in Stalinist edition, declared the right of free assembly to Soviet people. And 2 years after the meeting of for Glasnost, Vladimir Bukovsky another young dissident, during his own trial, accused Soviet party, Communist Party, and Soviet regime in very selective implementation of this article of Constitution. The quotation: "There was no necessity to introduce such article of the Constitution for the state-organized demonstration. It is evident that nobody will never disperse it. We do not need pro-freedom if there is no contra-freedom." End of quotation. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union, arrests of dissidents for their violation of public order during protest actions illustrated these conflicts of two conceptions of public sphere: the sphere to contest the state power and the sphere to improve it and to represent it. And the symbol of dissident conception of public sphere was the demonstration of on the Red Square in August 1968. It is a part of the artistic work of Swedish artist, and in the center we can find a cartoon of Natalia Gorbanevskaya, Soviet poet and dissident, who was one of those who came to this to the Red Square and to protest against Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in the August 1968. All of the participants of this demonstration were detained in a few minutes after the demonstration began, and they were imprisoned and sentenced to different exiles and imprisoned in specific mental hospitals. But this demonstration became the very symbol of the whole dissident movement, because, first of all, multiply slogans that used dissidents. There were not only the banner with "Niet," like this cartoon, but the slogans referred to Soviet power, to Soviet citizens, to people of Czechoslovakia, and to world opinion. And the most important, the most famous slogan of this event was "For our freedom and for yours, за вашу и нашу свободу." It was a slogan of solidarity and manifestation of freedom. And it was one reason because of different political forces could reuse this symbolical legacy of this public protest. But for me, it's more important that the very space, the Red Square, shaped the protest message of this demonstration. Red Square, as you know, is the heart of the country, and it's the implementation, the ultimate implementation of the regime of publicity that I described. The only demonstration of support of Soviet regime could be expressed here near Kremlin walls. No protest actions. And it was the place very important for Soviet pantheon, symbolical hierarchy, because there is a Lenin mausoleum and the graves of revolutionaries and Soviet leaders. Thus, it wasn't surprising to anyone that all of dissidents, participants of this demonstration, were detained. And this demonstration, as other dissident public protests, problematized the very capacity to speak and to act publicly in the conditions of state unfreedom. The square itself, Red Square, Dvortsovaya Square, or other squares, the city space, became not only the media for the protest action, but also the protest message itself. Public action in condition of limited civil freedoms is not only a manifestation of political demands, like free Czechoslovakia or free Hungary or free Soviet people, but the manifestation of the moral and political right to the voice these demands. And although during Perestroika, here is a photo of Первомай demonstration of 1990, and there is a column of anarchists that use this slogan "За вашу и нашу свободу." You can see it. For yours, freedom, and for ours. Although during Perestroika in 1990s, reforms, contentious repertoires changed, and mass rallies became more and more popular, to the 2000s, this form of protest, massive rallies faded because of different reasons, and one of them was that legislative regulation of rallies and other mass events. This special law of quite strict during the Putin rules. Thus, the protesters of 2000s began to reinvent, actualize, and reconsider the Soviet dissident legacy. And here is a photo of Pussy Riot first wide media-covered performance on the same place, Red Square. They made a punk performance. Putin pissed himself in fear, and they used not only the symbolical power of the place, but also they quoted the slogan for yours freedom and for ours. And when they expressed the meaning of their postmodernist performance, they said that they appeared directly to the legacy of Natalia Gorbanevska and her co-protesters from the 60s. And jumping to conclusion, I want to perform some results. This Soviet control and discipline institution, party, police, Komsomol, KGB, and others, tried to control the public sphere and allowed only to express the support to the regime on the squares, streets, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, late Soviet regime of publicity was also the successor of early Soviet forms of protest and direct democracy. Thus, weakening of the control and promoting at the same time the cultural memory lead of Soviets and early party discussions, as it was in during the Thaw period and during Perestroika years, it led to political mobilization. Meanwhile, this mobilization had it limited because of this very strict regime of publicity in Soviet space. So anything that happened in public space will automatically stigmatized as a political crime. As the Soviet regime of over-controlling public sphere remained in the 2000s, contemporary protests began to reinvent, reopen, and reconsider the legacy of Soviet protesters. And at the very end of my presentation, I would like to gratitude my colleagues from Memorial Center from St. Petersburg and for inspiring to different projects, and part of some of them I'm a part of them. And I would like to present our new project, the Islands of Unfreedom, a kind of web catalog of such different public actions in Petrograd, Leningrad, and in contemporary St. Petersburg from 1918 till 21st century. And we collect examples of like a public protest, non-conformist art, some strange cases as the Krasilnikov case, and I hope that it could become a valuable source for you and for our colleagues, historians, art historians, social scientists, and a platform to discuss different experience of free people that act in condition of state unfreedom. Thank you for your attention.
Kevin.
I'm going to use the podium just so that we can adjust the lighting a little bit, because I have some images that I hope you'll be able to see well. Is this what we're going to go for in terms of lighting? But they were going to make a slight adjustment. But I'll start so that we don't lose time. So my talk is titled, oh, first of all, I should say thank you so much for inviting me to, first of all, the Kennan Institute. It's really nice to be back. It's been over 20 years. It's been exactly 20 years, actually, 21 years since I was here on a short-term grant. And also to Dmitry for bringing me in on this really fun panel this afternoon. All right, so the title is Anti-State Aesthetics in the Age of Postmodern Politics, from Alexander Skidan to Katie Chukhrov. I will be discussing today several cultural figures who have attempted since the start of the new millennium to use experimental postmodern art and poetry as platforms for oppositional critique from the left in the Russian Federation. Chiefly the poet Alexander Skidan and the writers and multimedia artists Pavel Arsenyev and Katie Chukhrov. But in the spirit of this presentation, I want to start by thinking through the recent history of cultural institutions and literary and artistic production in Russian society, and rolling the story back 20 or 30 or even 40 years. So to add to Dmitry's presentation, this is a famous public demonstration of both aesthetic, I guess primarily of aesthetic dissent, in the late Soviet Union, the famous bulldozer exhibit of 1974 that was organized by a number of underground artists in an urban park space on the outskirts of Moscow. The exhibit was broken up almost immediately by the authorities using bulldozers, hence the name of the exhibition. The last decades of state socialism were a time when art and literature in the USSR seemed to many people to be really important and inherently political. Everyone, the state authorities, the official artistic establishment that supported, or at least didn't oppose the regime, and the unofficial artists who carried out their own programs without official approval, everyone agreed that art was deadly serious and a potent force in society. The authorities persecuted nonconformist artists with a zeal that suggested that they considered that art, out of bounds, could bring down the Warsaw Pact and the USSR. Pictures and books. What is more, even funny or irreverent pictures, or very thick, very highbrow books, defeating a nuclear superpower. It almost seems quaint from the perspective of the present, but there you have it. Even more amazing, if we fast forward 15 years from the bulldozer exhibit, it seemed at the close of the Soviet era that in part, this was just what was happening. Official literary journals that boasted 50 or 200,000 subscribers published formerly banned literature like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's novels and his historical literary epic, The Gulag Archipelago, which was published in 1989 in the journal The New World, as you see here, helping to deliver what seemed like a death blow to the legitimacy of the Soviet regime. Underground art and poetry, too, such as that of the Moscow Conceptualist Circle, flowed out into public space, revealing that the king of Soviet Marxist-Leninist ideology was naked, channeling years of Soviet joke lore in the irreverent mode of styob, the mocking, ironic deflation of regnant and stagnant dogmas. Yet if we scroll forward just a couple more years into the post-Soviet era, the consensus of everyone shifted. It seemed in the early 90s that once the Soviet regime, with its insistence on the importance of sustaining an orthodox socialist people's art and suppressing everything else, passed into history, art and literature would lose their central importance in Russian cultural life. They would become just like they are in the West, a zone of free expression, a realm of autonomous aesthetic activity, to use the approved philosophical terminology, in which therefore is one where political ideas can be expressed, but where they're not taken all that seriously. In normal art in the liberal world, art obeys the rules of economics rather than politics in the first instance. And this means that it has no special purchase, either on the attention of society as a whole or on social meaningfulness. Already in the 1990s, the early 1990s, the underground Russian conceptualist artist and poet, or formerly underground Russian conceptualist artist and poet, Dmitry Prigov, who at one time had been punitively incarcerated in a psychological hospital, explained that once the USSR had been laughed into history, so too the figure of the poet, national hero, will be claimed by history, and it will be left to literature to be simply literature. Or we can turn to Andrew Wachtel's analysis of post-socialist literature in 2006. I can say with some, quote, I can say with some confidence that the sociocultural conditions that once allowed for the appearance of Milan Kunderas no longer exist in most of post-communist Eastern Europe, and they are unlikely to return in the near future. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, literature, at least in the traditional sense of serious fiction, drama, and poetry, is no longer perceived to be as important as it once was. Yet, we should also observe that the transformation of the status and political meaning of, in particular, postmodern art, such as that of Prigov himself, has changed rapidly, not merely as a result of the fall of the USSR, but also as a result of the rise of postmodern politics in Russia. So before continuing, I want to offer a brief explanation of what I mean by the term postmodernism. Since the return of President Putin to power in 2012, and even more so since the election of President Trump, there's been much media chatter about how postmodernism is to blame for the current sorry state of the world and politics for the generalized cynicism of the post-truth world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. in which the assumption that there are no ultimate truths leads to the conclusion that it's okay to lie and manipulate, and so on. In one common account, postmodern philosophers like Frederick Jameson and Francois Lyotard came up with the fundamental post-truth propositions. These propositions, and then were then bought into by the rest of the world, and look where we are now. It's a nonsensical and anti-historical account. Jameson and Lyotard described the social condition of the world as they saw it. They were critics of what they described as a loss of faith in meta-narratives and the rise of a world of media illusion and manipulation that came on the scene in the United States, in their accounts, in the 1970s and 1980s. The art and literature that rose alongside those theorists, novelists like Don DeLillo or David Foster Wallace, for instance, contributed to this critique, showing us a world in which every utterance is a pose and every image is a forgery. I think it's useful to make a distinction between postmodernity, the social condition that we all live in, and postmodernism as a style of art or theoretical critique. Postmodernity was not caused by postmodernism. Postmodernism is a response to postmodernity. In the late USSR, postmodernist art and literature, as critique, had its golden hour. It seemed especially potent in that time and place because it was clear to everyone that Soviet ideology was a pack of lies that served vested interests, and therefore a perfect target for postmodernist demonstrations that ridiculed its hollowness. I love these images, actually, of Dmitry Prigov and Lev Rubinstein impersonating Brezhnev and Honecker on the left, and Timur Kibirov, the conceptualist poet in the late 80s, images that demonstrate efficiently how this mode of aesthetics works. Yet this strategy lost its edge in the post-Soviet era. In the late 1980s and 1990s, Russian thinkers assumed that postmodern irony, such as on display here, by deflating overblown and false political truths, was in its essence a democratic and emancipatory force. Take this 1987 statement by conceptualist theorist Mikhail Epstein, who claimed that the Tower of Babel of postmodern social life and poetry is, quote, a model for the future Russian democracy. As we now recognize, post-truth regimes are not so beneficial for democracy. They also render postmodern art rather less potent as a tool of critique. The rise of postmodern politics, Russian style, has led to savvy management of all past Russian culture, including that of Russian postmodernists themselves. There are now permanent galleries devoted to Prigov and to the great Russian conceptual installation artist Ilya Kabakov in the State Hermitage Museum. Some years back, Roman Abramovich purchased Kabakov's back catalog for a reported $60 million. The demotion of art to commodity that Prigov so presciently foresaw has extended emphatically to his own art and writing. All of which helps to articulate the basic question facing opposition-minded Russian postmodern artists and writers now. In the postmodern age, when everything is for show, when all utterances are known already to be in quotation marks, when the establishment can so easily co-opt all artistic and literary work of the past, no matter how revolutionary, how is one to use art and literature to express sincere political meanings or contribute to oppositional politics? The first lucid attempts to answer this question in the Russian public sphere date to 2003, announced by the first issue of the neo-Marxist art and politics newspaper, What Is to Be Done. In that publication, the poet Alexander Skidan, in an essay titled Theses on the Politicization of Art, proposed to reinvigorate postmodern art of critique. If the world throws up ideological illusions, the task of oppositional art is to show the cracks in these illusions by means of their critical deflation. Although the politics of the new era pretends to offer absolute values, such as the nation or the sacred, it's in fact only interested in what can be bought and sold. Yet in my reading, Skidan's essay ends, and this is its last paragraph, with more questions than answers. Instead of false truths, he proposes that art must offer better ones that cannot be bought and sold. Eroticism, laughter, pointless expenditure, and sacrifice. Yet it's difficult to tell the difference, I think, between these truths and the false ones. And how can you demonstrate that postmodern political art is not, or at least not primarily, also for sale? Let me turn to two concrete examples that take on parts of the problem of postmodern art in the context of Russia's social and political postmodernity. The first is Pavel Arsenyev. Arsenyev is a St. Petersburg poet and media artist. Like Skidan, an associate of the What Is to Be Done group, he is the founder and editor of the journal Translit, an independent-minded journal of experimental literature, art, and leftist politics, and of the associated publishing project Kraft, which is a series of short leftist literary and theoretical books. He's best known to a broader public in Russia and elsewhere as the author of one of the most recognized slogans of the 2011-2012 protest movements that emblazoned across a banner became a multiply remediated image of protest. Вы даже не представляете нас. The phrase, for those who don't have Russian, is a pun based on the two meanings of the verb представлять, to represent, and to imagine, resulting in the twin readings of the slogan, you don't even represent us, you can't even imagine us. Today, I want to consider his work with the Laboratory of Poetic Actionism, which was a group undertaking that he participated in from 2008 to 2012, along with the poets Ramina Sminkin and Dina Gatina. In his work with this group, Arsenyev's main strategy with regard to restoring the political potential of art and literature was that of remediation, the redeployment of past oppositional culture in order to reinvigorate its political significance. Arsenyev's work is riddled with references to the Russian revolutionary avant-garde of the 1920s, and also to neo-avant-gardes of later eras. The moniker Actionism, that was the name of the group, evokes the Viennese variant, of course, via its more recent Russian reception in figures of the 1990s art scene, like Oleg Kulik, the godfather of the Vaina, and then the Pussy Riot groups. A significant portion of Arsenyev's work in the Library of Poetic Actionism consisted in redeployment of texts of the avant-garde and the neo-avant-gardes. Among his projects we find, for instance, Mayakovsky for Sale, a video composed of found language on the internet, which received its title from an ad for a used Mayakovsky collected works. Other projects involved the installation of texts by late Soviet nonconformist conceptualist poet Vsevolod Nekrasov in public spaces. I want to examine more closely one of Arsenyev's video projects, his 2011 work, Dotted Composition, in which he and Gatina redeployed poetic texts written in 1973 by Moscow conceptualist Andrei Monastirsky. The texts were initially used in a group performance and co-production in Monastirsky's apartment with a small number of artist friends, in which he read aloud, giving the members of the audience 5 minutes to sketch a reaction to each of the poems he read. Arsenyev and Gatina, in a riff on this performance calling for visual response to texts, inscribed the poems line by line into the Petersburg cityscape and then recorded and edited the work into a video. Will it load? I'm going to back up and restart it. So Arsenyev and Gatina's choices for the location of inscriptions varies from the completely abstract, such as just what we just saw, to the completely illustrative, such as the next shot. In thinking about remediation, consider the effect of transforming what was originally a form of private, existential, or artistic investigation into one of the oldest known forms of street art, the graffito. Beyond the video itself, the project is productive of the fragmentary trace of these poems across the city, where they rub shoulders with other graffiti art. The implications of reading these traces in their new environments range from commentary on the disassociation and Brownian motion of urban life, to what is nearly straightforward political commentary. In analysis of the remediation of the poem via the video document that was disseminated via Facebook and social networks, I think we need to consider it as a recirculation, not only of the original text in a clever new enactment, but also of these new graffiti texts with their newfound political and existential motifs. The video, therefore, is a remediation of the graffiti remediation of an original that was intended for a different form of remediation, in other words. Arseniev's accomplishment consists in his reactivation of the dormant political potential of the nonconformist experimental art of the past. Monastyrski's work, like that of most other underground artists and writers of the Soviet period, reached the select audience via informal relationships or apartment exhibitions, samizdat or tamizdat. Nonconformist art was tremendously varied in its aesthetic and political import in the Soviet era, yet in the conditions of the interdiction on non-socialist artistic activity in toto, any non-state art was in and of itself a radical political gesture, regardless of shape, size, or meaning. To seize aesthetic autonomy from the state, engaging in unsanctioned artistic exchange with a few other artists in your apartment, was to enunciate art's political potential simply by enacting its freedom from the state. In the post-Soviet era, everything is different. Monastyrski's conceptualist poem, read in an apartment or placed in a museum alongside Kabakov and Prigov, offers no political charge whatsoever. Instead, Arseniev makes it real again by putting it on the streets. Let me now turn to my second example, that of Katie Chukhrov. Chukhrov is a Moscow-based writer and multimedia artist. Born in Soviet Georgia, she was propelled by the civil war and economic devastation of the Soviet collapse out of the Caucasus, landing at Moscow State University, where she studied literature and philosophy, and now holds a position at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. Chukrov's mature work is a form of conceptual dramatic writing and performance that confounds description, in which characters from contemporary Russian social life come into surprising configurations and speak in tongues. Audience expectations are continuously upended. Is it parody? Is it realism? Is it comedy? Is it satire? The form is recognizably dramatic, but something is always askew in character's speech, which sways between usually incompatible registers. Naturalistic dialogue peppered with scraps of found language seem normal enough for contemporary theater, especially in the context of Moscow's new drama scene of the 2000s. Yet in Chukrov's works, it's said in lines of verse, at times rhyming and sing-song, and often veers off into poetic diction and philosophical and political discourse. To top it all, Chukrov, a classically trained musician, often sings her work in a quasi-religious liturgical form. This is an excerpt from her 2008 work, Afghan Kuzminki, that takes its name from a Moscow street market, a dialogue between two street vendors who haggle over a price for sex, but unexpectedly arrive at what appears to be a sincere sense of both political and sensual commonality, expressed in a combination of obscene and philosophical language with recitations of poetry by Marina Tsvetaeva. Block your ears if you don't like swearing. The work's ultimate significance, as Marietta Božović describes it in a forthcoming article, is articulation of a radical poetics of erotics, a feminine sublime that's comparable to the poetics of the Canadian poet Rachel Carson. Quote, a sublime that erases itself, that does not domesticate violence, that arises from the kenosis of the vanished lyric subject, as Božović puts it. An attempt to find new solidarities between people who realize their human commonality and their shared abjection. Now, in several of her other works, Chukhrov confronts the problem of sincerity in postmodern art and literature head-on. The 2009 work Communion is a satirical portrait of an uber-rich Moscow socialite who dabbles in contemporary art, who hires a guest worker from Ingushetia named Diamara to paint her apartment. Communion is a hilarious send-up of the rich socialite Nita and her hanger-on friend Ira, who alternate between venerating miracle-working icons and praying for legs like Naomi Campbell's, and between planning to have Diamara baptized and abusing her and firing her for making a mess in the toilet. But at the end of the work, however, as Diamara leaves the socialite's apartment behind, the audience overhears her phone call to a friend, revealing that she herself, I'm almost done, she herself is a conceptual artist. She's been acting the part of Diamara, taping the entire affair in order to make conceptual art. In other words, the wealthy Muscovites only thought they were abusing a poor migrant worker. Instead, the whole encounter was a fake that will propel the career of another wealthy Muscovite who dabbles in contemporary art. This gesture, revealing that it was all an act, refers back to Chukhrov, of course. It poses openly the question of whether contemporary art, like communion itself, is really intended to carry out social satire on disparities of wealth and privilege, or just a way of earning money and status in Moscow's art scene. On the other hand, we might also ask, by posing this question openly, telling her audience that it's all an act, there are no real socialites and guest workers here, does Chukhrov redeem her work? I mean, after all, the satire of the socialites is still biting, right? Well, maybe. Chukhrov's play within a play activates the fundamental challenge facing postmodern art as a critique of postmodern political, social, and economic reality, which is that postmodern art is itself embedded in that reality. As each of the artists I've discussed here has achieved success in the Russian cultural scene, each has become more and more susceptible to the critique implicit in Chukhrov's work. Maybe, after all, oppositional art is just another form of profitable fakery, just a game that wealthy Muscovites play, either completely cynically or in order to assuage their guilt with a piece of false conscience. I will not conclude with a conclusive and determinative resolution of this problem, for ultimately it can't be completely solved in the era of normalized Russian postmodernity. The only true test of whether political art and literature of this sort is sincere or merely a posture is actual engagement in protest, actual risk of loss, and genuine investment in political action. To the credit of Skidan, Arsenyev, and Chukhrov, each has persisted in various forms of engagement from the mid-2000s through the protest movements of 2011 and 12 to the present. Yet in the overall landscape of Russian politics and artistic literary establishment, the true proof of concept of postmodern art will only come when the barricades are thrown up for real. Thank you.
Mikhail.
Thank you. So, okay. I want to thank everyone for coming to listen to us, and I want to thank Dmitry, Kozlov, and Kennan Institute for inviting me to join this workshop. I'm going to tell about the most recent cultural innovation in Russia, one of the most recent, so-called Monsteration. Monsteration was invented in Novosibirsk, and for Novosibirsk it is a kind of a event of the year. Even if Monsterations happen in different cities all over the country now, in Novosibirsk, Monsteration is a very special event. And I lived in Novosibirsk for almost all of my adult life, and I enjoyed the possibility to take part in Monsterations every year. So what you will hear is more like field report, not a deep analysis, semantic analysis of this event, political analysis of it, just a story of what happens in there and what are the keys to analyze Monsteration from the point of view of how the public space is used in contemporary Russia to discuss, or maybe not to discuss, but just to present or over-represent someone's concerns, relations of society and the state, and so on. So, okay, what's the button? Okay, so Novosibirsk is one of the biggest cities in Russia, deep in Siberia, and this is a city there you have center. This is the central big street, which is called Red Boulevard, Krasny Prospect, This name has nothing to do with the Soviet life, Soviet power. It emerged before the revolution and never was changed. And you have a square in the center of the city, which is entitled, sorry, I lost this. Okay, so here it is. This is a Lenin Square. And you have Lenin staying in the middle of the square, and this opera theater, which is the biggest and the most well-known city, like the most remarkable building in this city. All tourists make pictures. It's a symbol of the town and so on. So this is one of the cities. Not every city in Russia has very, very defined center, but Novosibirsk has. So every meaningful event must happen in there on Lenin Square. And it's a good place in the sense that people come there just to spend time, to enjoy being in there, like lying on the grass and so on. So Monsteration is a parade. Then people make senseless, weird posters, just keep them in hands and go along the streets. And it is important to make this poster or banner by yourself. So like on the right you see a picture, someone is just writing something haphazardly because maybe they didn't care to take something with them, but being at the place, the guys were just too enthusiastic about what's going on, and they decided to join the crowd. I prefer to use the word weird instead of absurd, which was in the description of this workshop, because I think weird is more like, it's not, most banners, they are not absurd in the sense that they are more paradoxical. They use wordplay, joke, irony, and some of them, most of them cannot be translated, unfortunately. So those of you who can read in Russian will have more fun of looking at the pictures. I'm sorry for that. I tried to do my best translating something. I doubt I succeeded all the times. Okay, so this on the left, you see someone standing with a banner, which naturally means let the reason flourish. But okay, blossom, thank you. So this is how it looks from inside. Mostly youngsters, but not only youngsters, sometimes people of very quite respected age join them. Many people just dress in different styles. They make improvisations on the street, and it's a kind of like atmosphere of fun, of a celebration. And every year, people in the city, they discuss, does it make any sense, or why would you go to Monsteration? It's for some people it's kind of disgrace to be in there. For others, it's a fun, and they prepare for weeks to take part in it. Nowadays, it's easier to do because the social networks are used heavily. Then Monsteration appeared. Friends invited friends, so only hundreds could join it. Nowadays, about the numbers are always contested, of course, but about maybe several thousand participants appear on the street. So in 2004, several they called themselves contemporary artists, but okay, so they people living in Novosibirsk and influenced by their peers living in St. Petersburg and Moscow, who belong to the circles studied by Kevin so attentively. But in Novosibirsk, the names are not known to anyone, and were not in that time. So they decided to join demonstration, communist demonstration, with a kind of absurd, weird slogans to show that the demonstration is senseless itself. So they were leftists, and for communists, 1st of May demonstration is a very important tradition. So every year they were just parading across this red boulevard, targeting to Red Square, to Lenin Square. So Monsteration would join them just with strange slogans in hand, and the most symbolical of them was that one, Tanya, don't cry. Some of them were arrested. Of course, they had to pay some fine, and the militia could not really understand what was going on, so they arrested them just because they somehow violated the public order. Since then, in many years, participants of Monsteration were arrested. They had to pay fines, so it's kind of a routine. It is expected. Then you go to Monsteration, they discuss that, well, some of you maybe will have to spend night, in detention. So this is the center, and this is the scheme. What I want to show is that we actually have the Red Square, Lenin Square in the center, and several squares around. So what is important for the municipal power not to let Monsteration to that Lenin Square. Every year they can go to this one of the squares around, and militia or police nowadays would block Red Boulevard not to let Monsteration to get into this sacred center of the city. And that's important. I think it's always produces kind of intrigue. It has this intrigue has its own history and some weird aspects, but I don't want to speak about them. What is interesting is that the history of Monsteration is actually this fight with the city municipal authorities for the order, for the right to get to the center. So in 2012, for example, the street was blocked, and Monsteration had to turn around to get to the small square. And every year, the road changes unexpectedly just in the days before Monsteration. So for many people in Novosibirsk, with all that politics surrounding Monsteration is a very interesting part of life. In different other cities of the city, people reproduce Monsteration, but it never became like a city-wide event. So then you read news from Russia. In May, you can read about Monsterations, and they happen actually in Moscow and somewhere else, and participants are arrested. But still, Novosibirsk Monsteration is the most is widest and most interesting, I think. So the crucial transformation happened in 2009. Then first, communists just decided not to make any demonstration in the center. So they make their own meetings somewhere else, but not in the center of the city. So this Lenin Square became empty, and city authorities had to introduce some sport events to happen in there to have a legal right to close the Lenin Square to forbid access to the Lenin Square for Monsteration. And if you could see it from this from above, you would see the empty square, and people have to circle it without a possibility to go inside. And the second event that happened in the same year, just by coincidence, that some Artyom Loskotov, whose name is quite well known now, was arrested. He was accused in drug dealing, which was a fake accusation. So it was clear that he was not involved in drugs. His friends knew that, so he had a reputation in the city. So his name became viral with picture of Artyom behind the bars. Became popular. It was published in newspapers and so on. And since then, he became a kind of unofficial leader of Monsteration. So the person who is morally and semi-officially responsible for this event. And he is making his job quite well, I would say, even until now. So about 10 years already. So this is how they block the street. You see the empty square just behind this police cordon. So people go to the park and they just stand with the banners, showing them to themselves and just laughing and having fun and so on. What is important is, I will just spend some minutes to speak about, just 3 minutes. It's to the point of political meaning of Monsteration. Every Monsteration since 2010 has so-called front banner. It is made always in secrecy by Artyom Loskutov and his friends, and they disclose this front banner and keep it so this Monsteration crowd has a structure. We have the upper part, the forward avant-garde, which is organized around this front banner, and rear guard, those who go behind. And these front banners have maybe some political meaning, maybe they are just jokes. So for 2010, it was like, if everyone begins to walk like this, it must be an anarchy. Next year, I think this was direct answer to "you don't even represent us" or "you don't even imagine us," invented half a year before. Больше-то с вами говорить не о чем. There is nothing else to talk with you about. So this is head of Monsteration. So since then, banners had different meanings, and you can see that they have like reference to the topics which we discussed in that time. For 2014, Ad Nash, which connotes to Krym Nash. Crimea is our, and here you have Hell is ours. For next year, God Have Mercy, which is my favorite. Здесь вам не Москва, this ain't Moscow, is a kudos to Novosibirsk regionalism is discussions of differences between the capital and the province. And this year, the banner was, this city needs us, not this rag. And many people think that it's about these coming elections, because this incumbent mayor, he is not that, not solid leader. He is probably he's about to lose the elections. So they say that it was about elections, but Artyom disproved any connections to your local politics. It's just a joke. So here are some theories which emerge about the precise meaning of Monsteration, which I'm not going to go into now. I just would say that Monstration is still a kind of paradox. It is discussed. People try to somehow produce a good interpretation of what is it, why is it interesting to be in there. It appeared just accidentally, so nobody planned this innovation. It's emerged from just idea of several persons to mock the communists' demonstration. But since then, it became an influential city event. Thank you.
Thank you, Mikhail. And we'll open the floor to questions in a minute. I just want to start, and I guess this is primarily directed to Dmitry, but all the panelists can jump in. And that is, of course, we've witnessed this new phenomenon, or the seemingly new phenomenon in Yekaterinburg over the last few weeks, where the state has actually seemed to have been on the defensive about how to defend a public space, and has seemingly opened up negotiations with the public as to what to do with this park and whether it should be turned into the site of a church. So from your perspective, is this kind of, not necessarily a turning point, but is this really a kind of a sign that the state is both right to be scared and has been put on the defensive in terms of how it reacts to public space? And should we anticipate a different reaction when confronted with a similar challenge?
I hope so. I think that I really hope so that the situation in Yekaterinburg or in our Arkhangelsk region where mass protest lead authority to negotiate with some in Yekaterinburg they are more successful than in for example Arkhangelsk where ecological protests against landfill in the southern part of the region, but I see that probably it's my mind, I'm not a political researcher, I'm a historian, and every comparison with the previous epoch is not fully truthful, but probably, and I hope so, that there is maybe the appearance of a new perestroika. I mean, in terms of mass rallies and mass political mobilization of every citizen. That before there's some event like attempts to build a church or attempt to create a landfill or attempt to something other local problems. They mobilize, they politicize, and they can become a new political force. And hope I'm the third time I say that I hope so.
Anyone else want to jump in on what's going on in Yekaterinburg?
Well, just a remark. In my perception, there are just two contradictions which just coincided in Ekaterinburg. One of them is that, it's a big problem in Russia. Developers, they prey on the lost, empty spaces in the centers of big cities, and local populations has don't have a say. So it's just contradiction which could be served if they had a mechanism of analysis of people moods and ideas about the city, it could be some compromise could be found. But those who were developers and city administration, which were placed on their side, they did not expect that people finally will try to strike back. And the second is just contradiction, is that Orthodox Church is a critical actor, because not many people are satisfied with this omnipresence of Orthodoxy, which just rose up in several last years. So it was just a case that this development project was connected with Orthodox Church.
Okay, let's open the floor to questions then. Matt.
Thank you all for your presentations. Mikhail, I would note it's not only a problem in Russia that developers take over the last square inches of open space.
Unfortunately.
I invite you to my neighborhood in Southwest Washington, D.C. to witness that. I have two intersecting comparative questions for any of the three of you, or all of the three of you. One is, if you look across the time periods that you have each studied, could you compare the degree of, I should back up and say, there's a lot of very typical Russian intelligentsia kind of wit and style to the protests that you've described. We think of that as a very Russian thing, even the term intelligentsia. If you compare over time, would you say that there's still the same degree of kind of classically Russian intelligentsia leadership to protest movements, for example, now versus 30 years ago versus 60 years ago? And then, if you could speculate, if any one of you wants to try, more global perspective. There are protest movements going on right now in France, right? But I don't think anybody would describe the Yellow Jackets as being intelligentsia. If you could speculate or say, is there something in particular about protests in Russia that attracts this particular type of style of protests, or do you see them everywhere all the time in the same degree?
As a historian, I should start, yes. I think that there are different protests. Even in the Soviet Union, it was mass protests of workers, strikes and mass riots that didn't led by intelligentsia or dissidents, like events in Novosibirsk or Murom in Timurtau, the riots in prisons and so on. So and in Perestroika, the mass rallies, they were not only consequences of Novy Mir or Oganyok or Gorbachev politics. So I think every particular event, which is maybe artistic performance, a mass rally, or anything else, should be analyzed in with different instruments, and so we should speak about different. There are no yellow jackets, yellow vests in Russia, but there is something else, and so on.
Yeah, I would add to that too. I mean, we could put to the strike of the long distance truckers several years back. There have been protests which reflect different socioeconomic formations in Russia. What I would say about intelligentsia in the contemporary moment is that it's, I think, struggling to figure out what its role is within the overall structure of public space in the Putin era. Or perhaps not struggling and falling into a certain kind of a cynicism. That could be the diagnosis for a different part of the intelligentsia. In the Soviet Union, why did the Soviet Union think that art was so important? Why did the Soviet leadership think that art was so important? Because it was assumed that the intelligentsia had a representational role with relationship to the people as a whole, that it was the mouthpiece of, and also in some ways could mobilize the nation as a whole, or the polity as a whole. The contemporary era is the first era, I think, in Russian history where the power, as Russians say, is speaking over the heads of the intelligentsia directly to narod, to the people, and thinks that it doesn't need intelligentsia anymore. Who cares what the intelligentsia says? If it protests, it has no significant impact on the actual beliefs of the electorate. At least it seems that way. The intelligentsia has been sort of, casting around, at least oppositionally minded intelligentsia, attempting to figure out how it connect its symbolic universe up with the actual language of real people. So that, these artists that I study, many of them accept as their sort of basic problem, how can I communicate with my crazy postmodern art with the, workers in the streets, these people in Afghan Kuzminki, this street market. Will they understand Katie Chukrov's, crazy postmodern drama about Afghan Kuzminki? It's not clear, although she tried to stage it there and had some conversations with workers or with traders in the market. So it's a kind of a disaggregation of the polity which has gone on over the past 20 years, and I think that that's really the major difference with regard to the function of protest and oppositional communication in general in Russia by comparison with the Soviet period.
I would want to add that in my perception, intelligentsia in this old sense of this word, this classic sense, which is you can meet in historical books, it doesn't exist anymore in Russia. So it's like small subculture, and in metropolitan cities no more. Some of people, those who belong to that group, sometimes they are lucky to become the persons who represent this or that case of protest. Protests happens everywhere, every time. It's kind of natural part of citizenship's life, right? So people protest. Sometimes those who are called themselves and are labeled as intelligentsia, they are lucky to appear on the screens explaining what's going on. But sometimes they even try to lead this protest. But quite a lot of protests, they just have nothing to do with intelligentsia or their values, because they have some economic reasons, because houses are built up on your backyard and so on. So it's nothing to do with this historical tradition of questions, terminal questions like Dostoevsky style and so on. But intelligentsia is still overrepresented in highly centralized Russian media. It is, but it's different story.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I see a lot of hands out. Let's take 3 questions here then. Let's take 1, 2, and 3. So in front here, and then Wayne, and then the gentleman in the back. So short questions.
Yes, thank you. Very illuminating. I'd like to ask Dmitry about what happens in the smaller cities in Russia. You focus mostly on St. Petersburg and on Moscow. And I realize that there may not have been extensive demonstrations, certainly in earlier years, but when they were, where were they? And how long were they allowed to continue, and who was behind them?
Okay, and Wayne?
Thank you. You've already to some degree addressed this. My question is about this relationship between what you've been discussing for an hour, which is essentially aesthetics, a cultural issue, which my old professor Jim Billington wrote about, a great deal and discussed, and its role in socioeconomic political factors. I mean, Jim Billington in the early 90s described the intelligentsia as the least responsible component of the Russian demographic. And it strikes me that, for example, you referred to Pussy Riot, which was explicitly political, but Kabakov was not. And I'm sort of left wondering what is sort of the bottom line in an institution here, the Wilson Center, which is supposed to relate the life of the mind, the intelligentsia, to public policy, to politics. Now, in American society, how would you relate what you've been discussing for the last hour in that regard in Russia? How would you relate the aesthetic, the cultural phenomenons that you've been describing to this whole question of the country's political life?
Okay.
That's a rather broad question, but maybe you can answer it.
And let's have hands again here, because we have time for a third. So, Marta, right here.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I have one really minor point to make in defense of the Poles, who were actually the ones who crafted for yours and our freedom in the mid-19th century. So this is just a matter. The other question I have is to Dmitry, and that is, you seem to conflate Russia and the Soviet Union. How are you handling that issue in your research, since many of the dissidents, many of whom I knew, this is, if you live long enough, you listen to your youth. And you certainly did, although I would have appreciated your mentioning Pavlik Litvinov. How do you handle the issue of Russia and the Soviet Union, or Russia against the Soviet Union? The other issue that you did not touch is the issue of the national protests that were both cultural and political. And the final issue that none of you touched, because I suppose it's not relevant, how do Russian dissidents view Russia's foreign policy towards Ukraine, the war in Ukraine?
Did you write all that down?
Okay.
Okay, so I've gotten some of it down. We'll start with Dmitry. What happens in the smaller states? And then pick up on Marta's questions. Russia versus the Soviet Union, national protests, and I guess the Russian dissident movement today, if you're in a position to comment on the Russian dissident movement today and its response to the developments in Ukraine.
Okay, I'll try to make a short answers. Of course, my presentation and my research at all did not present everything that happened in Soviet Union from 50s and in every city, but I tried to analyze the places and the spaces for this protest, and so even in Moscow and Leningrad there were not a lot of public protests, but some actions like from graffitis and desacralization of monuments and something like this, spreading of leaflets they were common in Smolensk, Arkhangelsk, and I think in every big city, like regional center, you can find several dissidents that were maybe not public, but they spread some izdat, they discussed some political views, maybe then they produced some their own texts, and some of them, even especially in after Hungarian and Czechoslovakian crisis, and in Polish crisis in the early 80s, different persons in different small and large cities of Soviet Union, they printed or wrote leaflets and put it on the walls on obcoms and or other buildings. And then another question, surely it were the Poles who invented the slogans, but it was Natalia Gorbanevska who changed the word order in this Poland, in these slogans, because in 18th and 19th century it was for our freedom and for yours, and Gorbanevska changed it for yours freedom and for ours. So firstly, we should so we can discuss this word order, and of course Pavel Litvinov was another participant of Red Square demonstration with Gorbanevska, Larisa Bagaras, Vadik Dlane, and others. And about Russia and the USSR, I have a case study on Leningrad as a historian, and of course I try to analyze only one city because I think it quite representative. But the question of national protests, as it was in Baltic states or in Ukraine or in Caucasus, they have their. I think the historians from these sovereign countries, they should make their own history. They write their own history, and there are different things that I cannot understand because of I don't speak Latvian or Georgian or something like this, and I cannot only reproduce some older books. And about I'm not I'm not sure that there are a kind of dissident movement now, and some of those who were dissidents in the 70s and 60s, they now they are very far from politics, and some of them others are active, and so we should speak about it. Maybe we should ask them, Litvinov or Bukovsky or someone else, what are their opinion. I think that there are different opinions.
Okay. And I don't want to forget Wayne's question, so Kevin and Mikhail, do you want to deal with the question of the relationship between aesthetics and public policy?
Oh, I am sitting here and thinking about this because, there are some scholarship about protests in Russia. And those who are involved in that scholarship, they sometimes discuss that there is a problem with symbols. To have a successful mass protest movement, you have to have symbols. In 2012, then there was a big tide of political protests in Russia connected with elections, and then with new elections re-elections of Putin. White ribbon appeared, but it did not become an influential symbol. So nobody wears white ribbon now in Russia, besides of some old intelligentsia in Moscow. There is no good symbol, and as soon as this symbol would appear, it would somehow influence and configure political protests as well. So there are two predictions about what is going to happen with political protests in Russia. Some people say that they should be erased. Protests must appear. Some say that they must would disappear, or at least won't become more want to achieve more influence on what is going on in the country. And so it's a highly discussed question. What is not discussed is that if a new aesthetics of protest would emerge, and that guys in St. Petersburg we tried for years to invest their energy into development of that symbols, and so they succeeded in something, it would heavily enforce the ability of people to mingle with around that symbols and to present the protests. So right now we can see maybe kind of process of crystallization of that aesthetical side of the protests. Definitely, Monsteration has another meaning. It's not a valuable way to protest, but very recently, and I think it's kind of interesting situation for any researcher. In the near future, something might emerge, and we'll see emergence of a new good symbol. Did I answer a question? May I just have just one
quick
point?
Then we want
Yes, about Ukraine. Well, the problem is that the war is going on, so it is discussed. So the families are separated. Friends just discard their friendships and so on. It is still heavily discussed, not as painfully as in 2014, but now it's a very hot topic. So there is still there is no definite positions for many people on that point, and the situation changes. So that's why it's like requires several years more to conceptualize it, I think.
Kevin, you wanted to?
I could add, I guess, a little bit. I mean, I think it would be a mistake to say that Kabakov's work wasn't political, in the sense that any non-state aesthetic activity in the Soviet Union was political because the Soviet Union declared that only state aesthetic activity was permissible. And that was a point that I tried to make in my presentation. And that really is the difference between then and now. We live in a moment in which art is always perceived to be conceptual, in which any sincerely espoused position in an artistic work is suspect, is always assumed to be a pose which is participating in the production of art within a capitalist system. It's intended to make money, not to make politics. To the question about the aesthetics of protest, I think reeling back to 2011, 2012, or to Arseniev, it's clear that one of the major problems of the protest movement was the inability of finding a symbolic language that people outside of the what was called at that point, not the intelligentsia, but the creative class could identify with. It wasn't actually, and it's a similar kind of a language to the one which is visible in Monsteration. It's the language of arch wit, punning, of irony, ironization over power, not of symbols that people can get behind. And that's the difference, I think, between the potency of the rhetoric of the state right now and the potency of intelligentsia or creative class protesters. The state has Ukraine, the state has the nation, and those are things which actually still do command a certain amount of sincere passion on the part of a great number of people within Russia. They're symbols which can be activated and which can get people moving. I don't think that the opposition has anything like that.
Well, I'm going to bring our discussion to a close because we can continue it at our reception across the way, but I want to thank all our speakers, thank all the supporters of the Billington Initiative, and thank you all for coming. So thanks very much.